All right, so welcome everyone. Today we are live with Michael Jones, who runs the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy. It's dedicated to creating apologetic videos and a bunch of different topics. There's some really great stuff there, so I imagine most of you have seen it, but I'd encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. So thanks for coming on today, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to come on.
Yeah, so the plan for today is we're gonna go through some common but bad arguments that atheists will make. You'll see these a lot in any conversation you have online, basically, and we're going to go over some of the flaws in them, and then if we have time at the end, we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A. So with that, you ready to get to it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so we'll just start off with a very common one, and that is the idea that there is no evidence for God, because I think we see this one a lot. It's just like every time that I tweet anything out or that anyone posts anything, there's always that atheist that says, but there's no evidence. So Michael's just gonna go over that one a little bit.
Yeah, well, what they should say is, I don't think the evidence that you present is good enough. Because when they say that, it's a condescending way to say it. Obviously, theists present evidence. I spend a hell of a lot of time presenting evidence on my channel. So this idea that there's no evidence is just a total misrepresentation of what's actually happening. It's not like theists are just going around saying, you should believe in God because it feels really good. We obviously are presenting evidence. And if you're not familiar with the literature, then you're obviously just ignorant. So obviously, a good amount of atheists, I don't know how many, realize theists present evidence. But they would rather say that than just saying, I don't think your evidence is good enough. For example, I'm not a young earth creationist. When a young earth creationist says, I have evidence of a young earth, I try not to say there's no evidence of a young earth. I try to say the evidence that young earth creationists present isn't good evidence, or it isn't sufficient. So it's kind of a rude remark, and it shows they're not really paying attention, or they're not even trying. In reality, there's tons of evidence for God's existence. The debate should be on is the evidence sufficient enough to warrant belief in God? So, I mean, we could go over tons of evidence from contingency arguments, moral arguments, fine-tuning arguments, the resurrection of Jesus, evidence for there. So obviously we present evidence, but they don't want to acknowledge that. And if you come across an atheist who does that, chances are they just don't know how to actually address the evidence from theism, and they'd rather just pretend there is no evidence.
So what would you do with the atheist that would say, hey, I want empirical evidence. I want to see God, smell, taste, all those, despite the senses, So how would you converse with one of them?
I would say that's shifting the goalposts, obviously. That's not necessarily how the evidence is going to work. Just like you wouldn't, if there were people who didn't think Abraham Lincoln existed, it would be ridiculous for them to say, well, won't believe in him unless I can see, touch, taste him. I mean, obviously, Abraham Lincoln existed, and you don't actually need to empirically see him. You could think of all sorts of other things, like the center of the earth. We can't necessarily see it. That doesn't mean it's not there. The bottom of the ocean, it's obviously there. We don't see it. A lot of things. People just basically accept, even though they cannot see, touch, feel any. It's special pleading of the highest order, and they're not really thinking that one through when they say those types of things. They're just applying a special standard to theism, and it could be possibly for emotional reasons. But I don't like to psychoanalyze people like street epistemologists do.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I just want to elaborate a little more on this, because I think that there's going to be a lot of atheists who would talk about the idea that you can't prove that God exists. So, like, at least in an empirical sense. So they'll say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's a classic. And you can't prove that God exists. So how would you, because I mean, you probably can't, but I'm just curious how you'd interact with someone that says, prove to me that God exists.
Oh, I would say that you can't prove anything. That's such a dumb quest, because science doesn't deal in proof. Even going back to Karl Popper, he talks about falsification. Science only falsifies certain theories. And later philosophers of science, like Thomas Kuhn, Henry Lakatos, Paul Feyerabend, said that doesn't even really capture what science is. Science doesn't, but they all agree science doesn't deal in proofs. Science deals in all sorts of other ways. to explain things, but it's not proof. So they don't have scientific proof that black holes exist. It's just the most likely explanation of the given data. So it's special pleading. They don't have proof for numerous other things they believe in, but apparently they need proof for God's existence. It comes down to what is the best explanation of reality. Is a theistic worldview going to explain far more data, or is a naturalistic worldview is? And what I argue on my channel is that from the moral argument, contingency arguments, digital physics argument, cosmic conscious argument, that theism can explain all of these things. Ethics, consciousness, the origins of space-time, all of these things with one simple explanation, namely that there was a universal necessary mind that the universe is contingent upon. Okay, so I've explained all these things with one explanation. And naturalists or materialists have to come up with all sorts of different convoluted explanations to get around these things. Right then and there, when you start looking at the evidence theism builds on, theism doesn't violate Occam's razor, because when you deal with naturalists, they'll come up with all different theories to explain these different arguments that we use for God's existence. And so we would just say that shows theism is far more plausible and far more parsimonious.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is a good transition into the next bad arguments that atheists make. Basically, that whenever a theist or a Christian presents an argument for God's existence, they'll say basically it's God of the gaps. Where you look at something like the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning, the design of life, things like that, they'll say, hey, that's really just God of the gaps idea. Like eventually science is gonna figure it out. I mean, he's not the most scholarly atheist, but Richard Dawkins always talks about how, the origin of the universe is waiting for the next Dawkins. Or I was reading a book by Stephen Hawking talking about the origin of the universe, and he's like, hey, this is like a great scientific mystery, but don't throw God into it. That's just scientifically irresponsible. We're going to solve this in the next 100 years. So how would you look at what do you look at, like, for starters, when you talk about someone says, hey, this is all just God of the gap stuff?
Yeah, I love that Aron Ra tries to claim that every argument for God's existence is just a God of the gaps. It just shows he's assuming naturalism. So any evidence for theism must be a gap argument, because we already know theism is false. That's the truth of it. When anyone ever says, that's a God of the gaps argument, it just shows you they're actually the one committing the logical fallacy, circular reasoning. They're assuming naturalism or materialism or some non-theistic worldview is already true. So any evidence a theist use must just be a gap argument, because we already know theism is false. It's just circular reasoning. So they're just saying, well, it's a gap in our knowledge, and they mean our naturalistic worldview. It's just a gap in our naturalistic worldview that we already have. And why we know theism is false. It's just circular reasoning. It's a horrible argument, and it's also a lazy argument. So just goes to show you, when people like Aron Ra use that type of argument, it's just how lazy they're being. They're not actually looking at the evidence, and they're just assuming their worldview. It's funny that he says every argument for God's existence is a fallacy, when his arguments against theism is very clearly a fallacy. But, he doesn't want to admit that. So, no, this is a bad argument. And when people say, well, we'll just solve this in the future, that is a gap argument. You're appealing to the unknown knowledge of future humans and using that to fill in the gap. Okay, the truth is we have to go on the evidence we have today. It could change tomorrow. And if that happens, we need to change and update our beliefs. But unless that happens, we should not assume our worldview and just expect people in the future to confirm what we already believe to be true. We have to go on the data that we have now. And right now, theism explains far more with far less. And also notice, when they say this is a God of the gaps, they're admitting their worldview has holes in it. They just call them gaps, and that makes it more. For some reason, they can get that past a lot of theists. But they're admitting there's a bunch of holes in their argument. There's a bunch of holes in their worldview, that they can't explain this, they can't explain that, but theism can, and they don't like that, so they just claim God of the gaps. What they're really saying is, there's all these holes in my worldview, but I'm still going to pretend that it's true, regardless of the evidence that I can't explain.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this kind of goes with, let's talk about maybe like the idea of that demonstrating that the supernatural exists. Because I know there's a lot of, like, Matt Dillon, I was just watching a debate with him. He talks about, like, there's no evidence that you can demonstrate that a supernatural realm exists. So then that we shouldn't even consider the supernatural realm, and everything should be considered naturally.
Well, I would ask him, I'd just say, let's go back to the evidence. Can you explain everything in natural terms? And the obvious answer is no. I mean, look at this beautiful face. You can't explain this in natural terms. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, you're right there.
But no, it's just, that's a ridiculous argument. First of all, the supernatural and naturalistic make much sense. What does that even mean? I've never got a clear defining line on something that's natural versus supernatural. People say, well, anything that we can empirically see. Okay, so are quarks not natural? Because we can't actually see quarks to infer they exist from evidence. Were black holes supernatural until we could take that picture, like within the past year? I mean, it's a ridiculous distinction. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, man, you're totally right there. I agree with you, and I think that a lot of times there's so many reports of the supernatural. I know a lot of them may be kind of off the deep end. So how do you differentiate? So this is something. I mean, this is a little bit off topic here, but talking about, let's say, like the disciples talked about how they saw the risen Jesus with, let's say, like me waking up in the middle of the night, looking out my window and seeing a UFO sighting. So, because this is a lot of the time they'll say, "Hey, that's the same thing right there." So, how do you differentiate between those two things?
Right. It's about the quality of the testimony. It's about what evidence you can present to strengthen the testimony. If you woke up and said you saw a UFO, I'd be like, okay, whatever. But if we lived in a culture where people were being put to death for preaching UFOs, and you said, I really did see one and I don't really care if I die for it, that might raise the probability that what you're saying is true. So if you take it to the grave, that's a good indication. If some of your testimony meets criteria of embarrassment, that might be a good way. If you can be confirmed by other reports, okay, that's going to raise probability. So it's about the quality of testimony, not just the testimony. And when they say it really shows you they're not paying attention to the data or the arguments. Because again, not all testimony is the same. How could you even assert that? I mean, obviously, all the same.
Yeah, 100%. So I want to keep it going here. So one of the next thing we talked about is the idea of the no true Scotsman. Now, I wasn't super familiar. I looked into this a little bit, but it's basically that if I'm right here, I mean, I could be totally wrong and a heretic and burned at the stake for this and being wrong. But from the way I understand it is basically you look at, let's say, like, for example, radical Islam, and you have these like ISIS killing people, and then a modern Muslim say, hey, they're not Muslims, and that's kind of where I get confused from beyond there. So maybe you want to talk about what that is, the no true Scotsman fallacy, and kind of like what's wrong with it.
Well, I would almost kind of agree with Muslims on that, because I need to be fair. If you can actually demonstrate that they're not holding to the core tenets of Islam, now I don't know, I'm not really an expert on that, but if you can demonstrate that, then I would be okay, whatever, fine. Because, I want to be fair. But I'm not an expert on Islam. That's more of like David Wood's area. So I wouldn't really want to comment on that necessarily. But what a new true Scotsman fallacy is, it's like a universal generalization. It's basically was coined by Anthony Flew. And basically, just imagine, you can't dismiss someone as a Scotsman for arbitrary reasons. So if you see a Scotsman eating porridge a certain way, and you say, no, you're not a Scotsman. No Scotsman eats their porridge that way. And they go, well, I really am a Scotsman. Here's my documentation. And they would then reply, well, no true Scotsman eats their porridge that way. You're dismissing their Scotsmanship because of an arbitrary reason. Obviously, how you eat your porridge doesn't determine if you're a Scotsman or not. So that's how the no true Scotsman fallacy should be used. If you're going to apply that to Christianity, you could say like, well, you're not a true Christian unless you believe in the rapture, or you're not a true Christian unless you believe in very specific interpretation of like Ephesians 5. Okay, obviously that's not required to be a Christian. That's not the core doctrine of Christian. That's a minor issue. So what a lot of atheists do, abuse this fallacy to the hill. Like they obviously don't know what this is. They just kind of throw it out when they don't have any other arguments. And this happened in my debate with Aron Ra during the Q&A. They don't understand the fallacy. They just use it whenever they feel it's necessary. So they'll just say, like, if you point out that this person is advocating that we go around and murder homosexuals, and I say, well, they're not being a true Christian because that's obviously goes against core doctrines of Christianity, they'll go, that's a no true Scotsman fallacy, because you're just dismissing that they're being a Christian because they don't agree with that specific thing you said. No, they're denying a very core doctrine of Christianity. Jesus did not command that. He commanded us to love our enemies, to pray for them, never commanded them to kill. He's not a true Christian. He's advocating things Christ did not command. Okay, so he's denying very core doctrines of Christianity. Therefore, it's not a no true Scotsman fallacy because it's not an arbitrary reason. And the way you deal with this when an atheist says this phrase, like they know what it means, is you go to analogies. If you watch the debate between Godless Engineer and the Distributist, he goes on about, the Godless Engineer goes on about how, like, you're not a true humanist if you would advocate the murdering of people, because humanism is completely against that. And it's like, well, yeah, obviously, neither is Christianity. We don't want people to be murdered. So if humanists do this, if humanists are not going to own the French Revolution and say, yeah, they're humanists, no, they're going to say flat out, they were not real humanists because they were advocating things like the Reign of Terror and the Great Terror and the murder of all these innocent people over arbitrary reasons. They were not true humanists. I go, okay, now apply that same logic to Christianity. Just get to say, well, they said they're a Christian, therefore they are. No, they have to hold to the core doctrines, just like any atheist would say, you're not a humanist unless you hold to core doctrines of humanism. Okay, the same logic applies both ways.
Yeah, 100%. So I'll just transition to the next question here. This is one I've actually seen a lot recently, and that's the idea that the New Testament was put together at Nicea, the Council of Nicea, which is really just kind of weird. Really no evidence. If you want to talk about something that actually has no evidence, it's probably this. But what do you look at when you hear someone say, oh yeah, it was just your Bible, your New Testament was put together at Nicea? How do you start? Where do you go with that conversation?
I just go, what's your source? That's all you have to say. And every time, they never have a source. You have to remember, sometimes you need to learn from how atheists, the very intelligent atheists, respond to people. Especially, watch a lot of atheists debate young earth creationists. A lot of times they just go, what's your source for that? What's your evidence for that? Apply the same logic with them. A lot of them go crazy when you do it because they don't expect it. Watch my debate with Matt Dillhunt. Around the hour and 18 minutes in, I told him that he needs a source and he didn't know how to respond or so. And he kind of went back a little bit. He didn't expect me to say that. It was my favorite part of the whole debate. But just ask them for a source. Half the time, they need to provide evidence for that. That's a positive claim they have made. So they need to provide evidence for it. Same when they say like Christianity causes X, like it causes murder, causes war. What's your source? In 9 times out of 10, they won't have a source. If they do, just read the source and see what it says. A lot of times you'll find out they didn't actually read the source. This happened to me just the other day. I just went and read the source and I said, it doesn't say what you're saying here. So just do that. And then I always go, if they made up the New Testament, why do we have things like P75, which is a large collection of John and Luke, which exists prior to Nicaea? And no scholar today says the canon was made up at Nicaea. If someone says this, they just didn't do their homework. And luckily, I think that objection is kind of dying out recently. It was more popular about 10 years ago, but as of late, I think it's kind of going away. Yeah.
What about the idea that they kind of picked and choose what was in the New Testament around that time? Because you have Constantine orders the 50 New Testaments. I think it was like 350-ish AD. And that's kind of like when they're like, a lot of people say, hey, that's when the New Testament is finalized. They picked those books. Thomas was left out. The Apocalypse of Peter, thing like that, were just left out. So they only put in what fitted with what they wanted their beliefs to be.
Yep, that's true. I would say absolutely. That's today we call that peer review. If a bunch of people submit articles to a journal and they reject them, we wouldn't say, well, those scientists, they're just picking and choosing what they want in there. No, they're doing peer review. They're going through and they're looking at these documents and they're saying, okay, this one is not attested by any early church fathers. We have very little evidence for it. It contradicts what the earliest eyewitnesses said, like Paul. We don't see it until late 2nd century when it comes to Thomas. So we're not going to use it. They did peer review. What's wrong with that? Why is it bad when the early church fathers putting the canon together did it, but not bad when authors who or editors of a peer review journal do the same type of logic. And yeah, it took a while to get the canon right, and I'm glad it did, because I didn't want them to just, throw a bunch of stuff in there and hope it works. I'm glad it took a lot of years and debate to figure out what are the most reliable and earliest documents we could put in there.
You think it's possible that the people who they made any mistakes? Like, there's a book that is, I can't think of any books that are similar to like the content of the New Testament that are claimed by the authority of impossible. You think it's possible that any books were left out of the New Testament by maybe not mistake, but they just left them out?
It depends on what we think we're trying to do. If we were trying to look for every possible inspired document, I don't think that's what they were trying to do. I think they were trying to canonize the faith. What do we believe and what do we teach? Here are the documents that show what we believe and what we teach. Could some have been left out? Maybe the Shepherd of Hermas would have helped. I don't think so. Maybe the epistles of Clement of Rome might have helped. Maybe, you could have included them. He was a disciple of Peter, but it wasn't necessary. They're just trying to give you what they believed. And I think they were being quite inclusive. They included all the early gospels that were available. 4. There isn't any evidence any other early gospels existed. They included all the gospels that were from the first century.
Yeah, actually, that's another common objection I just thought of, going to the Gospels. And it's basically the idea that the Gospels say that Jesus resurrected, but really no other source. You have outside of the first century, they'll be like, hey, Josephus was obviously fabricated, so obviously you can't trust him. So if you're looking for the idea that Jesus resurrected, you're only looking at the 4 Gospels within the first century.
Yeah, I think it's an argument from silence. That's not a really good argument to begin with. Of course, we wouldn't expect non-Christians to talk about the resurrection. They weren't Christians. They didn't believe in the resurrection. It's like if you scoured my videos and go, how come you don't mention any Rastafarian miracles? Because I don't believe they were real. What do you want from me? It's like we wouldn't expect a non-Christian to talk about Christian ideas that much. We're so lucky that we have so many as it is.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. Good. 4 Gospels. So here's another thing. I'm just kind of going off on a tangent here a little bit because I'm thinking about the Gospels now. So what about the idea that John was just kind of they try to fill in the gaps, basically, like the idea that Jesus' divinity comes in with the early church, the very early church. So then the author of John, who's most likely John, just kind of puts in all the Jesus divinity stuff in the New Testament.
Yep. Of course he was filling in gaps. That doesn't mean he was making it up. I think the gospel authors were filling in gaps. So look at in 1 Corinthians 15. He cites an early creed. He talks about an appearance to James and an individual appearance to Peter. He's just sort of reciting knowledge they already know about. He's just reminding them of this. So then the Gospels come on, they don't mention those. Why? Well, I think they were supplementing what the early oral traditions were already there. So they were just trying to give more additional information to what the early church already knew and espoused. And I think then people later in life were like, well, we want to hear more about Jesus. So John wrote his gospel to give them more information. I don't see that as any problem. It's like just asking more eyewitnesses, tell me more. What's wrong with it? It doesn't mean they made it up.
Yeah, definitely. So what about, because I think that they'll say, hey, the divinity of Jesus is a pretty core doctrine of Christianity, the idea that Jesus is God. So wouldn't the early writers like Paul, they'll say Paul never mentions it. The Gospels really don't. The first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, never really mentioned that Jesus is divine. So and I feel like they say, that's a pretty important thing. So they're just leaving out. So obviously the Bible is corrupted because XYZ.
So I'm thinking of doing this video. I don't know the time right now, but so N.T. Wright wrote like a 1,500-page book called Paul and the Faithfulness of God. And I read it. If you have the time. Yeah, I will show it to you.
Dude, that's oh my gosh. I think
hold on. It's two books. That's how big it is. It's 2 books. And my dogs ripped off the cover of this book because, they're dogs. But this is how big it is. And it's a great book. It went through and I just highlighted a bunch of it. So, we ran another page. So there's your I have highlights throughout. But yeah, it's a book. But he has got a whole section on Paul's monotheism, and he argues extensively that Paul a lot of times alludes to, or he actually will talk about Jesus, but he will quote Old Testament passages that are about Yahweh. And he'll say, he'll use these Old Testament passages to talk about Jesus in really obvious ways where he's clearly showing that Jesus is Yahweh. And so that's missed a lot of times because we're not that familiar with the Old Testament. But the section on monotheism in there is actually really great, and he explains why Paul is being a monotheist and saying that Jesus is God. So I would say that's quite early. As well as Jesus, throughout the Synoptic Gospels calls himself the Son of Man, which is a reference to Daniel 7, which is this divine figure that rides on the clouds and is given dominion and authority, and people worship him. You also have to remember in the Old Testament, only Yahweh rides the clouds. No one else can. Yet the Son of Man rides the clouds. So the Son of Man is Yahweh. And so if you look at people like Michael Heiser, check out my video, The Trinity in the Old Testament, there's a lot of evidence of this early Trinitarian ideas in the Old Testament.
Yeah. So let's keep going on this topic a little bit here. So why don't you think that the New Testament explicitly says, like, hey, Jesus is God. This is an important doctrine?
Well, because that's not how Jews would speak of that. You have to remember they're surrounded by polytheists. So if Jesus would have just said, "I'm God," well, the Jews didn't have a word for God. Now, I know that's hard to believe, but they didn't, because when you and I say God, we think of an omnipotent, eternal creator. To them, that was just Yahweh. They had a term called Elohim, but the term Elohim meant any spiritual being. So when Samuel is brought up by the necromancer, when Saul summons him back in the Old Testament, he's called an Elohim. Angels are referred to as Elohims. It just meant any spiritual being. They didn't have a word for God like we do. They just said Elohim, and we translate that as God. It's not a really good translation, but it's the best we can do with English. So just keep that in mind. So Jesus goes around and makes clear indications that he's Yahweh. Numerous places, like him walking on the water. That's an indication he's Yahweh. Because it goes back to a psalm where, he will have power over the sea and everything like that. Michael Heiser talks about it.
Yeah, 100%. So I'll transition to another one of these bad arguments that atheists will make. And this is one I've actually seen many, many times now. And that's the idea that the Gospels basically just created a Messiah that fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. You'll see this especially with like the idea of the virgin birth, and the word in Hebrew doesn't actually mean virgin, but the people who would interpret it, they just interpret it to be virgin. And so how would you, maybe a basic idea of how you would respond to someone who says that the Gospels just created a Messiah that would make the people of Israel who are occupied by the Romans feel better?
I would say yes and no. In some sense, they kind of did reinterpret a lot of these Old Testament passages, but I don't think that's a bad thing. That was part of the cultural context. That's kind of what they did. So Paul Copan wrote an article on this. I think it's like, did the New Testament authors misquote the Old Testament? And he basically explains what they're doing is they're not saying Jesus fulfilled these prophecies. They're speaking of Jesus as he sort of reenacted the Old Testament. So think of a very obvious example. Him going into the wilderness for 40 days is a reenactment of wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. So his baptism is, of course, a reenactment of crossing the Red Sea. These types of things. Feeding of the 5,000, it's a reenactment of something some of the prophets did. That happens a lot. His triumphant entry into Jerusalem is also reenactments. A lot of this happens. And so they just sort of looked through the Old Testament and just found comparisons to make. And so see that we can compare this to Jesus did. So you have to think Bruce Molina and Richard Roba wrote something called Social Science Commentary on the Synoptic Gospels. And this is one of the things they note, is that a lot of times the gospel authors will look at things in the Old Testament, and they'll look at things in Jesus that Jesus did, and they'll go, what can I compare this to into the Old Testament? And they'll just find things to compare to, and they'll make these connections on purpose. People do that today. This is why we call random football games David and Goliath stories. Or you'll see people comparing their life events to being Daniel and the lions. People just do that. the gospel authors did that much in part of the context, far more than it is for us.
Yeah. So what about the idea that maybe Jesus is a legend, not the pagan myth idea, because that's obviously, I'll talk about that a little bit later.
That's
but
bonkers.
There's some really great, some really great videos on that, by the way. So yeah,
Thanks.
but we'll go for something else later. For now, I can't talk right now. We'll do that later. So the idea that what if they just they just read and like, oh, here's Isaiah 53, so we're just going to create Jesus to be crucified, or the Psalms 23, kind of the same idea. They just kind of looked at these prophecies and made a figure that fit them.
Oh, so wait, they made a figure that fit them. What do you mean by that?
Like they made maybe like that Jesus could have existed, but they just try to make these. They see the Old Testament prophecies, and they just kind of.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
All together when they
I
wrote the figure and said, "Hey, yeah."
Yeah, I don't think that works for the same reason. Just because you draw from the Old Testament, that doesn't mean you made up a person. That when Jesus mythicists do this. I mean, Robert Price spends a hell of a lot of time trying to do this, and it's just I just kind of chuckle when he does it. I'm like, you're wasting time. Like scholars know that when they looked into the Old Testament and make comparisons to Jesus, that doesn't help your case that Jesus didn't exist. I mean, that's compatible with both views. It's just a waste of time for them when they do this. So just because they look to the Old Testament to make comparisons, that doesn't mean these people didn't exist. Virgil does this with Augustus Caesar. He compares Augustus Caesar all the time to tales in Roman mythology, various different gods. That doesn't mean Augustus Caesar didn't exist.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll just go on to the next one here, because I mean, these are pretty bad arguments. You don't have to have a lot of the whole detail. So this is probably, I think, the worst argument against Christianity of the history of the world. And I think any atheist that says this is really just not thinking. And that's the idea that there's 2,500 gods and the Christian God's just one more. So basically we're all just atheists, and Christians are believing one more God than the atheists do.
Yeah, when they do this, it shows you they don't know what they're talking about. Because it's not about the quantity within a belief, it's about the quality of the belief itself. There are polytheists. So there's a guy named Ocean, who I've debated in the past on Capturing Christianity. He's a polytheist. Does that mean he's more of a theist than me because he believes in many gods? No, that'd be silly. Atheists would use the exact same arguments on him they would use on me. Perhaps, maybe they may not use certain arguments because I believe in an omnipotent God. He doesn't. But they would not say that he's more of a theist than I am, because it's obviously about the quality of beliefs, not quantities. So they're obviously sure they're not really trying when it comes to this. They're just, you're just trying to throw anything out and hope that it sticks. It would be like if I held to a pluralist view within moral realism. I'm using that as a very obscure example, but there's different types of moral realism. Well, they would not say that you're just. If I was a monistic moral realist, as I only believed in one virtue, they wouldn't say, well, you're just one less virtue away from being a moral subjectivist. No, that's not how that would work. That would be a dumb argument. But no, this is the type of arguments they make, and they obviously have not thought these through. It's about the quality of a belief. Theism is part of a worldview, and theism typically entails the idea we believe in a God. But if I was a polytheist, that wouldn't necessarily mean they're more of a theist. So it just doesn't even make sense when they say this, because you're not really even attacking why I believe there is one God. You're just trying to count. Okay, good. You can count to one. Good job.
I mean, I guess sometimes with the atheists, it really feels like that's about all they can do.
There's some very smart atheists.
There are some very smart ones, yeah. And I guess it goes both ways, where there's people that just aren't really smart at all. So yeah, I guess that's a little unfair there. So what about the idea that faith is blind? Like you talk, like there'll be these atheists that'll say, hey, faith is blind. I don't want to have blind belief. Trying to think here. I just lack a belief, so I don't have faith in anything. And really, it's just you guys, and I'm not going to have faith. Faith is for people that just want to believe something.
Yeah, this is a ridiculous argument, and I just debated Aron Ra, and I tried to really press him in the cross-examination on this. but because they just make this up. There's no definition that says this is what faith is. Faith is not a belief without evidence. It's not blind. Faith is not. It's just the same thing as trust. That's really what it is. You don't trust itself is not blind belief. It's basically something you get from evidence or no evidence, but it can be either way. It doesn't entail there has to be necessarily no evidence. So when they do this, they're just not even trying. They're trying to define our terms for us and what we mean by these things. And they've not looked at the original Greek. They've not looked at what this word meant in Greek. And anyway, just go watch my video with Aron Ra. It was almost kind of comical the way he was trying to get around this. But no scholar defines pistis, the Greek word for faith, as blind. It would be absurd. So atheists are just making things up and they're not even trying. They're trying to define our terms for us, which is quite rude.
Yeah, 100%. We should never put words into someone else's mouth. That's one of the most annoying things I think that we can do. So let's talk a little bit about, because you have a lot of videos on this, the idea that Jesus came from pagan myths. Because I know there's this kind of like this picture that's been spreading around, and it's basically like these 6 or 8 like pagan gods, and it's like, hey, they're all born of a virgin, resurrected, things like that. So, and they'll say, hey, Jesus is really just a copy of these pagan myths. So I'm just curious what your response would be to that idea.
Yeah, that's just stupid. I mean, there's no other word for it. I read a book a few months ago called The Riddle of Resurrection by Trygve Mettinger. And so he goes through and he's arguing that, he argues that Baal was a dying and rising god. He argues that Melkart was a dying and rising god. And he argues that Tammuz was a dying and rising god. I don't agree with him on Tammuz. I don't agree with him on Baal. He might have a case on Melkart. Okay, so, but he gets to the epilogue and he says, by the way, this has nothing to do with what Christians believe when it came to Jesus. That's a completely different thing. So someone who is even writing on this, he says, yeah, that's a dumb idea. There's no scholar that says this outside of like Richard Carrier. And, he's, very fringe and far out there and holds to some pretty crazy ideas and misquotes a lot of scholars and whatnot. It's kind of comical sometimes to read it. But so it's just a dumb argument. You obviously are not even trying. You're not familiar with the scholarship on it. Just read Trygve Mettinger's book. Go through it and read his arguments. He makes some pretty good points along the way. I ultimately agree more with Mark Smith's when it comes to dying and rising gods. But this idea that Christianity was based on that, there's just no evidence for it. In fact, there's another book written by a guy named Glenn Bowersock. He wrote a book, I believe it's called History is Fiction, that I read a while back. And he basically argues that a lot of the pagan mystery cults were borrowing from Christianity when it comes to people like Philostratus, Philostratus' Life of Apollonius, Dionysius cults, Attis cults. They were the ones borrowing from the Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries and sort of adjusting their cults to compete with Christianity. So Jan Bremer and Glenn Bowersock argue the borrowing was going the other way around, ironically.
Yeah. I was thinking, someone just like replied to one of my tweets or something. They just basically talked about, hey, Jesus is a pagan myth. Like even Bart Ehrman agrees that he's a pagan myth. And I just kind of looked at that. I'm like, I'm pretty sure he doesn't look that way. And I just looked it up because I was just like, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't wrong here. And he wrote a whole book about how Jesus was a real person, not from pagan myths. So it's just kind of, I was like, oh man, that's kind of, like when people say that they're an atheist because of the logic, especially people like that, I'm just like, no, this just doesn't make sense. Just when you say something like that, and it's just kind of way out there.
Yeah, I come across a lot of atheists that are just like, they're just very unfamiliar with all of these things. It's unfortunate, but, and then they talk, I love that they just call themselves, we're the rationalists. I'm like, that is just, I'm sorry, but when I hear this stuff, when people call themselves, or when they name their channel something like rationalists, or, we're the rational thinkers, I'm always like, that comes across as kind of a little arrogant. I mean, maybe my channel is, I'm inspiring, maybe, but I don't know. I just get so sick of atheists constantly calling themselves rationalists. I mean, you don't have a trademark on that word. Maybe I'm being unfair. I don't know.
No, I think you're being pretty fair. I mean, you can't just kind of presuppose that something's true, which is what they do oftentimes, and then say, hey, I'm being rational here. That's not really like the Kalam argument video from Rationality Rules. Like, that's just kind of like he took the simplest form of the argument and just said, hey, I just debunked
I don't even like the Kalam, and even I was like, that video's horrible.
Yeah, it's pretty bad, no doubt. And yeah, Cameron's doing some pretty cool stuff with that, just talking about how stupid that video is. So what about the idea? So this is the next one I want to go to. The idea that there is no outside evidence for the martyrdom of the apostles. Basically, kind of like, because I see this like from some people that I've looked at, like this one guy that always just is annoying, tweets dumb questions, but this one actually made me think a little bit. It's basically like, hey, show me that the apostles died for their faith, but don't use the Bible to prove the Bible. Don't use those early church fathers' letters of talking about how like Peter died or like things like that. So
yeah, I always say stop that. That's not good scholarship. The very liberal scholars even use the New Testament. So don't sit here and tell me I can't use the New Testament when scholars use the New Testament as historical sources. They may not agree with everything in there, but they use them as historical sources. Stop that stupid argument. You just can't say, you can't use this one ancient document because I don't like it. That's a bad argument. You may disagree with things in there, but make arguments why they may have gotten X, Y, and Z wrong. But even the very liberal scholars will say they got X, Y, and Z wrong, but they got A, B, and C right. So bad argument to begin with. And outside of the New Testament, first of all, we have Tacitus talking about how the Christians were persecuted under Nero. Suetonius talks about how the Jews were expelled from Rome on account of Chrestus, so there's persecution there. Clement of Rome talks about how Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome, so you have that as well. Paul talks about persecutions that happened. Acts talks about how there were martyrs and whatnot. So we do have numerous sources talking about this. Is some left to legend? Yeah. We're not sure if Thomas really was martyred in India. Maybe, maybe not. But I didn't use that as part of my case for the resurrection. So I went on the sources that we actually have, and if you have any, if you want to see the full list of the reliable sources, just see part 2 of my resurrection series.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to think. There's like Peter, Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, and James of.
Well, there's another one. I forgot. James is mentioned in Josephus for being martyred.
Yeah, James, brother of Jesus, and then and then there's James, the son of Zebedee. Is that right? He's the other one that like there's really strong evidence for.
Yeah, well, I think it's an Acts. I'd have to go back and check my sources on that specifically. But the idea people say you can't use the New Testament is a pretty bad argument.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think, like, I was just like looking at the martyrdom. I can never say that word. I always said it like mortar, but now I say it martyr. I say it right. But they talked about the martyrdom of Peter, and basically it's in John where basically like Jesus is prophesying. Oh my gosh, I can't speak about how Peter is going to become a martyr, and basically you can look at it as a Christian and say, hey, you know, Jesus is prophesying and he becomes a martyr, or you can say, hey, John just made up the whole thing and made Jesus sound like it, but he's still a martyr for the faith. So, I mean, there's really great evidence for the martyrs. So this is another objection. This is more of a culture one rather than a evidence-based one. It's basically the idea that the Bible is out of touch with today's society. Let's say it's for something like homosexuality. Like they'll say, hey, you know, homosexuality is obviously okay, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just the Bible is outdated on this topic. And you can even see this with like the liberal churches and the liberal Christians. Like there's downtown in my town, there's a bunch of churches with just rainbow flags, you know. And so how do you look at that idea?
Well, I say, yeah, that's basically what every failed empire has said. You know, you Christians are out of touch with the way things are. I mean, yeah, the Bible is out of touch with today's society. Duh. We never said anything different. Of course it is. We don't agree with what today's society is preaching in a lot of ways. So of course we're out of touch. It doesn't mean it's wrong. Just stating the obvious is not an argument. Well, of course we're on different pages. Let's argue which is more likely true, which is going to be the most beneficial.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, I agree. So that's really all the bad arguments I had. I don't know if you have any more you see commonly, but I mean, just kind of like, it's almost kind of sad to me a little bit to see, like, you know, like I get having a strong like you can make an intellectual case for being an atheist, but I think it's kind of sad sometimes when people bring up these really bad arguments that are obviously not true.
Yeah, well, they're not thinking that hard. I mean, there's some really bad arguments that I've seen Christians use. Don't get me wrong. And I've sometimes even scolded Christians for using those bad arguments. But, I mean, what kind of bothers me is just atheists just, a lot of times, unfortunately, I get them, they come across as quite arrogant. And they pretend to be the objective rationalist that just wants the evidence, and that's just not true. Just be honest with yourself. That's just not the way people are. We all are biased to some degree, and we have to fight every day to limit that. If you can accept that, that's just gonna be better for yourself and for how you present yourself in your arguments. Don't just pretend you're just this objective, rational, unbiased person that just wants evidence. It's not who you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think oftentimes, I think people on both sides can be guilty, but people will believe what they want to believe and try to justify it rather than actually trying to figure out what's true. So, I mean, actually, I'm actually kind of curious. What are some of your bad arguments that Christians will make sometimes? Just throw it in the opposite direction here.
A lot of Christians will just say, if you're just an atheist because you just want to sin. Don't say that. Maybe don't psychoanalyze people. You don't know everything about them. And when you say that, even if you're right about them, it doesn't come across the right way. Jesus said to be as wise as serpents, or as crafty as serpents, and as gentle as doves. Not as loud as a baboon, and as angry as a tiger. You got to come across in an understanding way, in a polite way, in a reasonable way. So, try to meet them where they are, and try to meet them and present the evidence, present your case. But don't say stuff like that. That's one I can think of off the top of my head I've heard. And it's just a bad argument.
Yeah, totally. There's actually one more I totally forgot about here, but this has been more, this argument's just been popularized very recently because of the genetically modified skeptic view about the Puddle argument. Basically, he just calls Frank Turek a liar, and it's kind of goes a little far there.
The Puddle argument.
Yeah. So how do you respond to the Puddle argument?
That's just entirely missing the point of the fine-tuning argument. So the problem is they would say, like, the puddle just fits in there. Well, it's not so much the fact that something fits with what it's in. It's the quality of what is in there. Excuse me. So a puddle is not something that's complex as, like, intelligent life. So this is a bad argument because it doesn't just simply compare in terms of quality. There's nothing more insane about this universe than life itself, and let alone intelligent life, which is just beyond belief that can happen. How did that happen? Well, the fine-tuning argument kind of explains there's this astronomically crazy parameters that got life to where it is, and these parameters need to be there for life to even exist. That's insane because life is so complicated, so intricate, so interesting. It just seems so odd that just lines up perfectly. When it comes to a puddle, there's nothing really interesting about a puddle or the shape of a puddle. It doesn't stand out as unique. There's nothing about the quality of it. And we see puddles forming all the time. There's billions upon billions of puddles that are formed on this planet. Okay, so it's like, so what? It doesn't really make the puddle itself unique. And so it just is another way to, I think it was John Leslie who gave you the fire squad analogy. And this is just simply a way to respond to that. It's like if the fine-tuning argument is more comparable to the firing squad analogy, not the puddle analogy. The puddle analogy doesn't even really capture the fine-tuning argument. And the firing squad analogy is like, if you are lined up and a bunch of expert marksmen are all lined to shoot you and they all miss, it'd be absurd for you to say, well, of course they missed. I'm still here. I mean, I wouldn't be here if they didn't miss. You're missing the entire point of what just happened. The odds of that actually happening are astronomically rare. There must have been some sort of design in that. That's far more likely than them just missing by accident. And so when people bring up the puddle analogy, it just shows they don't understand the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, that's all the bad arguments I have. Do you want to go to some of there's been a bunch of questions here. Do you want to go through some of these questions that were asked?
Yeah, sure. Sure, go ahead. I can do it for a little while. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Yeah, we can go for like 10, 15, 20 minutes. I don't know, whatever works for you. Yeah. All right, sweet. So I'll just start at the top here with some of these questions. So This guy says, just subscribe. Yeah, he says, what should I do as a Christian when other Christians tell me that I have to reject evolution and accept intelligent design? I don't see how it matters.
What's the data that shows you have to? I mean, you just when it comes to the evolution creation debate, you don't have to accept one or the other to be a Christian. I think even Answers in Genesis acknowledges that. So when people say this, it just shows they don't understand what it means to be a Christian. And there's a lot of really good logical arguments to explain this. I mean, there's a lot of good, really compatible, parsimonious interpretations of Genesis. So I think that's just a dumb argument, and I would always just simply ask why. Why do I have to accept intelligent design? And typically they'll go to a theological point. Okay, so it's not so much intelligent design, it's this theological issue you have. Let's talk about that instead, because that's really where the heart is.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll go through another question here. This is, oh my gosh, this is an intense question. I hope you don't mind. It says, okay, what are your views on the suicide of Christians? I've heard people say it's a one-way ticket to hell, but the Bible isn't really specific on it.
Well, I don't think the Bible is going to be specific on it because it's not. There is no one size fits all. It really depends on what's in the heart of the person and what's going through them. And God is going to judge them on the information they had available and what they used. Just see John 9:41 or John 15:22, where Jesus basically says, if I had not come, they would not be guilty. So it's based on the information they had. So I don't think you can just say it's always going to be X or it's always going to be Y. It's going to be different based on the individual. And I don't think we as Christians should say that it's a one size fits all when it comes to something like that. We don't know ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think it's a one-way ticket to hell because, I mean, the Bible says the only unforgivable sin is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. So he doesn't say blasphemy the Holy Spirit and killing yourself. So I think there's obviously, like you said, God is just. He's going to decide and be right. Next question says, how can free will be compatible with the B theory of time if the future already exists and there is no objective time to make choices in?
That's B theory does not entail determinism. It's still me in the future that is making those decisions. It's just the ontology of how time is laid out. So in this very moment in time, I'm making decisions based on my prior experience and the information I have available. And it's still this conscious free will, still this conscious agent with free will that's making the choices. Just because all time might be existing simultaneously and I'm in the future making decisions as well, that doesn't mean I'm determined to make those decisions. It's still me making those decisions. So I never really understood that objection. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't really get to the grasp of what the difference between B and A theory of time are.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm actually not familiar with it at all, so I'll just say you're right because you're probably right. So next question says, hi, I'm grappling with the census problem of Luke. Oxford Bible Odyssey says Luke made an error. I'm actually not. I feel like I should be familiar with some.
Yeah, this is a big thing. This is probably the one thing in the Bible that skeptics run to because it just sort of implies that Luke made an error because he mentions the census under Quirinius. There's a possibility it may have been this is that Luke wrote the Greek to be understood as this is the census before Quirinius was governor in Syria. It's possible. It's not definite. There's problems with that as well. I think Darrell Bach has the best answer is that this census began under Herod, but it was put on hold until Quirinius came in and finished it. So basically, this is the census that's associated with Quirinius. It's sort of like today, under a president, they started building a highway, but it wasn't finished until like 2 or 3 presidents later, and he took credit for it. You could say you associate this highway with the later president, not with the president that started it.
Yeah, definitely. Next question here says, can you ask IP if he will respond to or debate TMM? Who's T? I don't know. Who's TMM?
I think it's the Messianic Manic, and I asked him to debate me in my blog years ago, and he said no. So I've already tried. He doesn't want to debate me. I wanted to debate him on the resurrection argument, and he decided to just simply make up things I never said, accuse me of saying things I never said, and yeah. So the guy is incredibly rude and condescending, and I already asked him if he wanted to debate me, and he said no. So I don't have to tell you.
Fair enough. That explains it. What was the book by Dr. Bach that you mentioned?
Daryl Bach. I don't think it was a book. It was in an interview he did for the a YouTube channel called the Ehrman Project. I think that's where I got that from. I don't remember the exact book he mentions it in. I have to look that up. I do remember specifically he does say this in an interview for the Ehrman Project.
Okay, fair enough. Someone says, do you think that the moral ontological argument is sound?
The moral ontological argument.
Yeah, I don't know if
those are two different arguments.
Oh, the modal. Oh my gosh, I totally read it wrong. My bad. It's the modal ontological.
Well, you're fired.
I'm illiterate. I should just quit.
Yeah, of course I do. I still think it's sound. I think it's reasonable. So yeah, I think it's a good argument. And I think the problem is that people just think it's too easy. You just can't prove God's existence with something so easy. And I go, well, it's still sound, and it doesn't really matter. And I think that's an appeal to emotion. You may not like the fact that it's so sound, that it's sound and it works, because it just seems too easy to you, but that's an appeal to emotion. Just go on the logic of it.
Yeah, definitely. Next question says, what do you think are the problems with Craig's moral argument?
I don't think there are problems when you get into the details of it. I just think his syllogism is misleading. And a lot of I remember watching a podcast on Real Life Theology, and they had, I forget who they had on, but it was an ex-Christian philosopher, and he was like, he just read Craig's moral argument, and he goes, okay, now what? How do you get from A to B in this? Because, you need to explain why, if God does not exist, there are no moral values and duties. So I think my main problem is it just doesn't explain enough in the premises. I think it just needs to say more, which is why I kind of put together my own. Because I think it just explains more in the premises, and I think that's important. I think some of Craig's arguments, like the Kalam or his moral argument, just don't explain enough in the premises. Not that they're not sound, because he spends a hell of a lot of time explaining why they are sound. But I just think to the layman who just sort of sees those arguments, they're going to go, I don't get it. And they may not spend the time looking into it. And I think they just should have been written better, I guess. So it's a semantic issue.
Yeah, fair enough. This is kind of a question I have based off that. So how would you demonstrate to someone or make the argument for an objective truth? Because I think that a lot of the times, people say, our morality comes objective morality. Oh my gosh, I'm so off today. Objective morality, because I think a lot of times people will say, morality comes from evolution, things like that. So how do you make the argument for objective morality?
They obviously don't understand what they're talking about. And I remember seeing Aron Ra try to debate people on this, and he doesn't understand what moral realism is, because he kept jumping between moral epistemology and normative ethics, but never getting to meta-ethics. Okay, I do think we evolved to understand morality. That doesn't mean that's what morality is. For the same reason we evolved to understand science, that doesn't mean science is just a social construct. Okay, we evolved to understand these types of things, but how we understand them is not what these things are. That should be obvious. So we just evolved the cognitive faculties to understand ethics. That doesn't mean ethics is subjective.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree with you there. Like everything else, you get great stuff. Next question says, what do you think of Tim Stratton's free-thinking argument for libertarian free will?
I don't know off the top of my head. I have to look it up.
Yeah, same actually. I'm not familiar. We'll just go to the next question. Have you interacted with a lot of Bart Ehrman's work in your research over the years?
Yes. Yes,
okay,
I have.
There it is.
I recently got it. What is this book I need to start reading? Shoot, what is it? It's like the 6th edition. That's what I remember, because I was trying to find the most up-to-date edition, and I had to get the 6th edition because that's the one that came out recently. I had to rent it from a library called like Redfin, because I couldn't get it anywhere. I don't know, the website's not loading, but yeah, I was kind of reading through that a little bit. It's this 6th edition. I'll look. We'll move to the next question, and I'll come back to this. I get the title because I've only started reading it. And I got distracted because I started sending stuff on bail recently for an upcoming video, and so I got Gotta get back to it. But this is the story of my life.
Yeah, fair enough. Will you ever do videos on like other religions, like Islam, Mormonism, JWs, things like that?
Yeah, eventually. I really like just defending Christian. Okay, sorry, the website just loaded. It's New Testament 6th edition and historical introduction to early Christian writings. So I'm kind of looking through that a little bit, and I have it rented for 180 days on redshelf.com. I don't know why I said Redfin. So yeah, I will look at other religions. I actually, I'll say some things about Mormonism because I was reading this book recently, and it's not a scholar. It's just a guy who traveled around America and wrote stories. But there's one interesting chapter where he spent a little time with Mormons, and it's hilarious. He joined Mormons on an unregistered, unscholarly archaeological dig in Mesoamerica, and it's hilarious because they didn't get licenses. They're not trained archaeologists. And so he also interviews actual Mesoamerican archaeologists, and they're just so annoyed by Mormons. These poor archaeologists say they're working on sites down in Mexico, and Mormons will spend their vacation days and they'll fly down there with metal detectors and headphones and ask to help out on the digs. And they go, no. So then they'll just see the Mormons walking around the sites, like looking for golden plates on the perimeters of where they're trying to do these digs. It's like, what do you do with these people? But yeah, I'd like to talk about Mormonism because it's just such a bad. There's so many problems with that. I think David Wood is kind of like got a corner on the market when it comes to Islam. I don't really feel a need to do that because I think other people have dealt with that so much. Maybe eventually I'll get to it. I'll eventually get to the idea that Muhammad is mentioned in the Bible, which is such a dumb argument. It's like, but I like defending Christianity. I want to go through the Old Testament, and let me explain why I'm not getting the other religions. It's because that has already been fulfilled. Other apologists have taken care of that. You don't see a lot of videos called the reliability of Genesis because not a lot of people are tackling those issues. So I'm building up a collection of arguments, and eventually I'll do a video called the reliability of Genesis, and I'll present all the arguments for why I think Genesis is an old and ancient document and why it's reliable. So not a lot of people are doing those types of things. You don't see a lot of people doing the archaeological evidence for the Exodus. I'm looking at stuff on that right now. You don't see a lot of people refuting the idea that the polytheism in the Bible. Michael Heiser does a lot on that, but it's not really drilled down to the layman level. So I want to go to the areas that a lot of people haven't really gone into. And I think that's where the need is, and I'm going to try to do a lot more with that before I go to tackle things other apologists have already gotten to. So, I think these are more important to get to. That's why I did recently my video, the archaeology of Eden, because not a lot of people have talked about this. So I'm going to do it because I'm going to try to go to the areas where people haven't been to.
Yeah, I try to watch a lot of your videos. That's actually a really fascinating video. What you really look at there is really great stuff. Next question says, what do you think of existential arguments for the existence of God?
I'm not really a fan of them. I get where they're coming from, but they come across more as like an appeal to emotion to me in a lot of ways. So they're not really my forte.
Okay, fair enough. Did Aaron take those books you offered to lend him at the end of your debate?
No, they're in the other room. You want me to go get them? No, he did not. He did not take them. He was offered them twice. Once by me, once by a guy named Matt, who he drove me there, and he walked over to Aron specifically, handed him, and Aron said, sure, I'll take him, set him on the table, and walked away without him. Such an odd coincidence he forgot him twice. So I'm skeptical that he forgot. Tyler Vela also offered him a big copy of sources. He didn't take that either. I'm skeptical that he even wanted them.
Man, what was that? I'm just curious. I mean, I have the debate saved in my watch later. I just haven't gotten to it yet. There's just so many things I want to watch. What was it like debating Aaron?
I had a lot of fun. He didn't have a lot of responses to the studies I brought up. The only thing I'm kicking myself on is I wish I would have gotten to the cross-examination, a bunch of questions I wanted to ask him. Because I wanted to say, where's your study for this? You mentioned this in your opening talk. Where's your study for that? You mentioned this in your opening talk. Because he mentioned a bunch of crap for which he didn't have evidence for. I just didn't have time to get to it because I got carried away in the whole faith thing and the other things and the Gregory Paul study that he brought up, which he wasn't even familiar with. But yeah, I had a lot of fun there. I got a lot of good feedback from them. I heard from a bunch of atheists who said I won the debate. And I've seen even some of his own fans saying that he lost. So my favorite comment was someone said, "You'll do even better next time." That was the full comment. And I was like, that is the most passive-aggressive way of saying you lost.
Fair enough. Let's keep going for a few more of these questions. This guy says, if Adam wasn't the first human, what does Paul mean in Acts 17 when he says that all nations came from one man?
That means all nations came from one man. It doesn't mean all people came from one man. It means that basically God, this actually fits with my understanding of Genesis when it comes to the temple inauguration view, is that Genesis 1 is talking about God assigning functions to how they're going to work within human civilizations. So God has established human civilizations through his theophany to humanity. He's revealed himself, and he has now taken the initiative to move humans to the next phase of establishing civilizations. So I think the fact that he says that fits more with the temple inauguration view, that God has sort of established how these different parts of nature will function within human civilizations. And all nations came from that.
Yeah. Just reading some more questions here. Have you seen the William Lane Craig, Jeff Hester debate?
No.
Okay, yeah, me either.
Yeah, as you said, there's so many debates, and I don't have time to get up to them all.
Yeah, there's so much good content on YouTube, and I mean, you can see like YouTubers like yourself and Mike Winger.
I know, and I fully understand when people,
really,
yeah, and I fully understand when people don't have time to watch my stuff. I don't scold. I try not to scold people for it because, as you said, there's so many people out there making content now. I understand if you don't have time to keep up. I'm just honored that so many people want to watch my stuff as it is. So, and I feel kind of bad because there's so much content, and it's hard to get to everything. So I get it. So if people don't see this or that, I try not to scold them. I just try to refer them to the video so they can watch it.
Yeah, definitely. Question says, if you can choose another Christian apologist to debate Aron Ra, who would that be?
William Lane Craig. But Craig won't debate anybody with a doctorate now. Sure, you can do it.
Not me.
Sure.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think William Lane Craig.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, I agree that that Craig won't, because he won't debate people who don't have doctorates. I don't know. I have to think about that to think of more topics. Maybe J. Warner Wallace.
Okay. Someone says, do you have a basis for your belief other than the Bible? I'm guessing that means your entire worldview, I guess. I don't know.
Depends on what subject we're in.
Yeah.
I have different books. I have a lot of books. I have books there. I have my giant stack right there. And then I have books there. And then I have another bookshelf in the other room. And then I'm trying to get more books on my computer because I'm running out of space. So I'm starting to use Google Books now. I just read a book by Trygve Medinger on Genesis 2 and 3. I have another book on Aboriginal religions I'm reading in there. So, yeah, I got a lot of books. What do you want?
Man, how much do you read? Because it seems like you have a lot of books and a lot of really great sources.
I try to read 30 pages a day of something. Maybe 40 pages a day, depending on my time. And so, that think about that. If I read 30 pages a day that's like 10,000 pages in a year. So how many books could I fit into that? Yeah, a lot.
Can't do that. I just got out of high school, took calculus, hated math, and now whenever someone throws a math problem at me, I'm just like, no, get away. Yeah, not my strong suit. I'm trying to see if there are any more questions here. What are your views on Calvinism? Would you consider doing a video on that one day?
No, I don't want to get into that. That's just too. To me, it's not that big of a detail, and I want to focus more on defending Christianity than internal disputes. Now, when I bring that up, people say, well, why do you focus so much on young earth creationists versus evolution? Because I have seen atheist after atheist who has abandoned their faith because they were told young earth creationism is the only thing they can believe they're a Christian. And I've seen it destroy so many Christians, and I just cannot tolerate that. So I stand against young earth creationism for the damage it causes. And don't sit here and tell me it doesn't cause damage. It causes so much damage. So I will willingly stand against that because I've seen what it does. But Calvinism, Arminianism, I don't think it's that big of a deal, so I don't get involved.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was talking with Ryan Pauly recently. I always get those two mixed up. He's talking about how like one of the biggest flaws we make in raising people. Obviously, I mean, I don't have kids. You have kids though. Like raising people is in the Christian homes is saying, hey, giving them too much that they have to believe. You know, like talking about like, hey, if you're a Christian, you believe in Jesus is resurrected, he's divine, Trinity, things like that. But I mean, like young earth, old earth, Calvinism, Arminianism, things like that. It's like, hey, we can debate those, but you don't have to pick a side to be a Christian. You can be a Christian and believe in either or in those topics.
And it's just, there's so many scientific problems with it. I mean, it's just to the point where it's like, and I think a lot of Christians now are sort of realizing that, and they're not being so dogmatic about such a view. So like when I go to churches or when I talk to people at churches, they're like, I don't really care. Like, it's just the view so often is like, I get from mostly what I hear from Christians is like, I'm not sure if I believe in all of evolution, but I don't really care. And so that's what I get from so many different pastors. So it's great. And I think that's the way to go. And I'm trying to encourage more of that it's not that big of a deal. And if once you start understanding Genesis, it's really not that big of a deal. So, and I think that's that. So I think there's some good things happening there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's like, man, I just totally lost. I need to fire myself. I'm having an off day. Someone says, how's IP doing? How you doing, Michael?
Great.
It's good stuff.
I don't know. I don't. I'm not good at small talk. I hate going. I always like when I moved to Tucson. I dreaded going to new churches because I just hate small talk. I'm just such an introvert. It's like I don't want to talk about the weather. I don't want to talk about me. I don't like talking about myself. Please don't make me do this. So.
Yeah, I mean, I get that completely. That's why, the best thing to do is always just ask most people about themselves. Most people love talking about themselves. Next question says, will you ever address modalism in detail?
Modalism?
Yeah, I think you mean like the idea that God
the heresy.
presents.
Yeah. Probably. I mean, I kind of indirectly addressed it in my Trinity series, but I might go back and redo some of those videos eventually. But yeah, I mean, I will. I'm going to do it in my view of defending Trinity.
Yeah, great stuff. So, I mean, that looks like all the questions that we basically have gone through. So I just want to say, thank you so much for doing this, man. It was really awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm glad to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we covered a lot of ground. We got through those bad arguments and I just had some good Q&A. So I'd encourage everyone. I mean, I'm sure most people watching are really front IP fans. But if you haven't heard of him, just be sure to subscribe to him on YouTube. I have all his links in the description. So, yeah, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to do it. I like helping channels like you grow. So if any of my followers are watching, please subscribe here and help out smaller channels. That's what I like to do.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And if you want to support us, you obviously subscribe, as Michael said. You can support us on Patreon, that stuff. We're trying to raise $500 a month. That's our big goal. And you can see our other websites, our social media, all that good stuff. So thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and just have a great night.